says up here, smile, have fun, play nice. Not in my profession. I had a paper planned, a great big paper planned for today, and then I noticed an article in the Salt Lake Tribune on last Saturday about the fair conference in which Scott mentioned that we don't attack people personally, we don't deal with personal attacks. So you're safe, George. I can't give that talk, so I had to do something different. My topic, and I'm going to go through some of these things very quickly because I think the more interesting part of this presentation is hearing from the man himself, George Throckmorton. But over the years, George and I had interesting conversations that we've talked about, reference to the Hoffman case and others, that we like to quote movies, statements out of movies. And our favorite one that relates to Hoffman, and what I think leads out in the myth-making of the Hoffman case, is a statement made at the end of a movie called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, starring John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, my opinion, the greatest Western of all time. And for those who don't remember this movie, I'll run through it very quickly. The movie starts with Jimmy Stewart and his wife returning to a little town in the West called Shinbone. He's been a U.S. Senator and been an ambassador, and he's returning with his wife to this little town to bury an old friend named Tom Donovan, played by John Wayne. And as they come into town, the local reporter sees him and then grabs the editor, and they come over and says, "What is this great statesman, this senator, doing in our little town of Shinbone?" And they said, "We're here to bury your friend." And the editor pushed the issue, "We need to talk to you. Well, who is this Tom Donovan?" So Jimmy Stewart agrees to talk with them and be interviewed. And he relays the story about, as a young lawyer, he came to town, got involved in the local politics, and came into conflict with a local outlaw named Liberty Valance, played marvelously by Lee Marvin. And during the conflict and the fight over becoming a state from a territory, he is challenged to a duel by Liberty Valance. At the same time, he's in competition with John Wayne over the girl. Well, after the election for delegates, he meets Liberty Valance on the street and shoots and kills him. He now becomes a hero and known as the man who shot Liberty Valance. They go to the territorial convention, and he decides to leave when he's pressured or accused of being a murderer. And as he's about to leave, John Wayne pulls him aside and explains to him that you did not shoot Liberty Valance, because during that shooting, I was in the alley and I shot and killed him, not you. And they reenact that scene. He then proceeds to go back in, become the delegate, they get statehood, and he becomes governor, senator, and wins the girl. Well, after he's explained this whole story and the reporter's writing all the notes, the editor takes these notes, tears them up, and throws them in the fire. And he's asked, "Well, Mr. Editor, why did you do that?" He got up, turned and looked at Jimmy Stewart and said, "This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." This fits in perfect for Mark Hoffman. Let me share quickly some of the examples I believe exist. And some of these are kind of fun, some of these we've all heard. First one is our friend Ed Decker from Saints Alive in Jesus. This is on his webpage. He has a book called Bearing the Testimony of Truth, compiled and edited by Derek S. Harnshaw. And it's been on there for a few years, and this morning it still was. This is a personal manuscript written by this gentleman. And there's some editorial notes that Ed Decker wrote at the beginning. This manuscript was completed and submitted during the brief time that the Mormon Church had accepted as true a fraudulent work generally called the White Salamander Letter by the infamous forger of Mormon manuscripts, Mark Hoffman. So we're talking about 1984. We have notified the author that this needs to be cleaned up and removed from the book, and will make the correction as soon as we receive the corrected copy. Okay? It still is interesting that the LDS Church created new doctrine to explain that a white salamander was really an angel. And when the hoax was revealed, it just as suddenly undid the doctrine, all without an apology or a blush. Wow. That's kind of, to eliminate something that never was really there, but I find that kind of humorous that we had a doctrine as such. I must have missed that meeting. Next one is an article out of the Salt Lake City Weekly from March of 2003. And it's a story about Gerald and Sandra Tanner and Utah Lighthouse Ministry. And in reviewing the Hoffman case, it says here, while many were taken by the notorious document forger and bomber Mark Hoffman, Gerald, with typical uncompromising accuracy, was not bamboozled. Collectors of historical documents from the LDS Church to the Library of Congress and Sotheby's were buying Hoffman documents as fast as he could manufacture them. Hoffman sold forged letters of famous Americana, and his major focus was forging early Mormon historical documents that were extremely damaging to LDS doctrine and early church leaders. All the while, only Gerald Tanner remained unimpressed and unconvinced of their authenticity. Now, we're talking about all these documents, and in 1984 publicly announced his misgivings, calling Hoffman a forger. 1984, this is a year before the homicides. I wondered about this. Now, it's pretty clear that Gerald and Sandra had some serious doubts and problems with the Salamander Letter, but not all of them. So not too long after this article came out, I visited with Sandra Tanner at their home, in their bookstore, and I asked them, is this a misprint? Is this a misunderstanding by the Weekly? And this is what Sandra told me. No. Gerald did have doubts about all the documents and really believed that Mark was a forger, but he had no solid proof. Okay, this is 18 years after the fact. Now this is being revealed in this article, but I have some serious problems with that in the fact that in some of the writings of the Tanners following the homicides, and I'll make it a little side note here because they made reference to the bombing forgeries of Hoffman. One thing that has been amazed me over the years, we always refer to Hoffman as the bomber or the bomber forger. We seem to be afraid to say what he is. He's a murderer. The forgeries and the bombings are secondary to the fact he killed 2 people. So if I had my preference, we'd call him what he is, a murderer. But anyway, I asked Sandra that, and she just said, well, he just didn't have any proof. Following the homicides, in some of the writings, they suggested that Mark wasn't that good of a forger or writer, that he must have had help. And they suggested that there was another individual who was forging the documents, and Mark was the middleman. And when this person either died or stopped doing the forgeries, Mark started doing his own, and that's when they became sloppy and so forth. Even as of last October, at a conference sponsored by an organization George belongs to, the Southwest Association of Forensic Document Examiners, Sandra and Gerald were there, and she was even asking people who were there if they had any ideas if anybody was helping Mark. So I'm getting 2 different stories here, but the significance of this is the fact that you read a lot of the web pages and some of the chat rooms, and they always say Gerald was the only one that knew that Mark was a forger. Everybody else believed him, and that isn't true at all. There were others that had doubts too, but I find that has one of the myths that have started. Another one of the myths that is frequently read about is the idea that there was going to be no trial of Mark Hoffman because the church did not want information passed out, and the fact that the leadership of the church, whoever they are, forced a plea bargain. The man that will be preceding me here, Mr. Throckmorton, has explained to me that on the day he was asked to leave employment from the Salt Lake County DA's investigator following the case, he was there when District Attorney Yoakum instructed Bob Stott, the lead investigator or lead prosecutor, that he will plea bargain the case. I've also heard from the mouths of Jerry D'Elia and Dave Briggs and a few others, people involved with the case, that the church had nothing to do with the plea bargain. This came strictly from Mr. Yoakum. And yet this is another story that you will read on web pages and chat rooms, that the church forced the plea bargain because they didn't want President Hinckley to testify or any other general authority. Now, another fun one that I found was interesting